I'm Dr. Kirk Harris. I am a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the School of Architecture in the Department of Urban Planning. I'm both a lawyer and a planner and have been working on issues related to the intersection of communities, family strengthening, planning, and policy for over 25 years, and have a very significant interest in questions of socioeconomic and racial equity in our American system, and have also served as the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities, which is a kind of an applied, both delivers some service, but it also works on applied issues related to institutional change and policy changes as it relates to family strengthening and community development. So, and of course, this issue of transportation has a significant implications for that work. So I'm glad to be on today. Well, structural racism is not only something that manifests in the transportation system, it manifests in every single system that operates in America, unfortunately. I know we're talking about transportation today, and but when we think about the larger historical context in which we understand racial inequality, we have to begin by appreciating that our society from its inception was racially divided. Chattel slavery was the fundamental structural issue that actually created enormous amounts of wealth in America. And it set up a system in which there were political, social, and economic relationships that supported that wealth creation and the subordination of individuals based on race. And so when we think about America as a system, we have to appreciate that fundamental beginning is the strand that runs through everything that defines the American experience. And so when we appreciate that, just reflecting back in my earlier comments that this issue of race permeates everything, and if we appreciate that, we can begin to understand why I say that. The other thing that's really important is when we talk about these issues of race, I often have to remind people that the issues of race are so fundamental, because if we talk about a society in which all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if we in fact believe that, if that principle is to be in play, then when we see these gross inequalities, these gross disparities, we have to question that principle. And we have to ask, how is it that we're living paradoxically aside that principle and seeing all these disparities? You know, I know this is not directly related to the question before us in terms of transportation, but I know what we've recently seen in terms of the George Floyd incident is just another expression of state-issued racism, in which these continued incidents of Black men being killed at the hands of police becomes just another reflection of how deep these issues are. And let us not forget that this is not the first instance that we've seen. I think we've had a very interesting reaction to that vis-a-vis other incidents, because quite frankly, I think, you know, unlike which is typical in America, where we consider ourselves individuals, this COVID-19 experience has kind of put us all in the same pot, experiencing the same fears and concerns, being homebound, etc. And then we had the unfortunate opportunity to witness a 9-minute killing on TV as a collective. And I think that really sparked something in people. And so I'm hoping that inflection point, as many of the inflection points that we've had in America, whether it be the civil rights movement, Reconstruction post the Civil War, or the George Floyd incident, this becomes an inflection point that moves us to a point where we're different than we were previously. But to respond directly, I know that was a long preface, but to respond directly to how structural racism is manifest in the transportation system, what we have to understand is we live in a highly segregated society. And that segregated society produces displacement of resources, or I should say the placement of resources in certain ways that advantage and disadvantage individuals. In our society, that advantage and disadvantage is premised on race and economic status. What we've done in our American segregated society is we've essentially subsidized the first of all, we've created policy to create the segregation. Then we've subsidized through a development in the form of suburbanization, in the form of highway construction, in the forms of urban renewal. We have then subsidized this segregation and created opportunities where we've separated people based on race and class. The outmigration, previous outmigration of whites from many of our major metropolitan areas also followed them was resources, and also those that displaced that movement, if you will, also created a subsidized response, which was in the forms of our highways. And it also created a very interesting challenge for us as a society, because what we had is we had individuals moving out to the suburban fringe, subsidized by federal housing policy, subsidized by highway construction. And it created a free rider problem because many of those individuals that were benefiting from the economic opportunities in the city weren't returning those dollars to the city for purposes of supporting it. And so what you had was individuals who were taking from the city but weren't contributing in any meaningful way. And economists call that a free rider problem, right? Because they took their tax dollars and everything else to the suburbs, and but yet they earned their income in the city. And so, and then, this gets exacerbated by public policies such as the one in Wisconsin, in which we allowed city workers to now operate outside of the city. They no longer need to be residents. It's just another way of displacing resources that should be existing in the city, being displaced outside of the city to the benefit of the region, but not to the benefit of the city. These kind of policies and practices create the splits and hyper segregation that we see today, and it just exacerbates the economic inequalities that permeate our society. One of the policies is the policy of segregation in and of itself. This, albeit no longer de jure, that is legalized segregation exists. The patterns of segregation that have been established through that de jure, those de jure and legal means are still firmly in place. And the fact that we still so heavily rely on highway construction, road construction, and minimize public transportation and other forms that would even, by the way, leave a much smaller carbon footprint on our society, we exacerbate, again, these inequalities. There are communities that are locked in to the the urban region, and but yet all of the development, jobs, and opportunities and resources that I mentioned in my earlier question are located in the region. And it's hard for individuals to navigate to the region because public transportation does not make the links easy. Housing is not available in those locations for those individuals, affordable housing. In fact, we've had incidents in the region in which mayors in particular, a mayor in particular city, which I guess I don't need to name, but probably everybody knows, has years ago had suggested that maybe it would be a good idea for those service workers who were in the city to have affordable housing, worker housing, and got a huge backlash because of the idea that you would have working class, low income workers come into the community to reside where they work. I think it's those kinds of systemic problems and reactions to making opportunity available to everyone is what continues to reinforce these problems. And, you know, in a democracy, and I keep going back to the democracy because as a lawyer, you know, I always kind of reflect on what are the principles that we allege to be operating on in this country. And one of the principles that we should be operating on, if we live in a democracy, we should all be sharing in the benefits and the burdens of society. And to the extent that there are those who are whose burdens are much higher and out of disproportion to the burdens of others, that represents a problem in our democracy. And so as we think of this question about mobility and the policies, remember, it's not only about mobility, it's also about access. So you can't speak about mobility without speaking about access. Access is limited by the segregation patterns and the practices. Mobility is limited by the policies which continue to create limitations for people being able to migrate outside to the region. And so both of those things, the confluence of both of those things exacerbate the problem that we have today. So we have individuals operating as second-class citizens essentially because they are not able to move where opportunity is. They are not able to go to the jobs. And if they are, it takes them so long and it's so costly, it makes no sense. And by the way, that just butts up against some of our other public policies related to our social safety net. A lot of times people under our existing social safety net have to work in order to receive those benefits. And so what you find is people working these low wage, non-living wage jobs, trapped in poverty. They can't get to the employment that might pay them a little higher wage, and they're stuck, and they can't afford the childcare and the other kinds of things that are so necessary for anybody who wants to be effective worker. So we ask a lot of individuals who are operating at the margins, who are vulnerable, and then we hoist on them these policies and practices that only make the situation worse. And so my view of it is that if we're going to address these things, we have to think holistically, and we have to stop subsidizing the privileged. And that's essentially what our public transportation, I should say our transportation system does. It subsidizes the privilege. It builds highways for individuals and roads for individuals who have cars, can afford to afford cars, and it worsens our environmental outcomes simultaneously. It makes no sense. So, with that long rendition, I would say there's so many things that are operating in our policy frame that just make no sense and just exacerbate the inequalities that we all say we want to eliminate. Well, let me just say that with respect to the question about highway expansion, growth, and development, in our urban renewal period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, highways were the development of highways consistent with the public policies for housing development in the suburbs actually decimated Black and brown communities. In fact, they would run through those communities, and they would then create barriers between in those communities, locking those communities in an even further segregated experience. So highways have been historically a defining structure for what I would call inequality in America, in our urban region. and the other thing is that, again, as I said in my earlier statement, it subsidizes the inequality because it gives preference for those who can use vehicles, motor vehicles, to migrate to, I should say, to navigate the region. So to the extent that you don't have a car, and to the extent that you're taking the resources that could conceivably be evenly distributed to public transportation and hoisting it in almost completely into, or a large percentage of which is in highway construction, you're not having the appreciation of again, the benefits and burdens of those decisions, those policy-making decisions, and their implications for vulnerable communities who are segregated and locked into our urban areas. So, so I think highways are notorious for that. I think our practices to support highways as a option, as opposed to investing in sound public transportation. Look, I traveled around Europe, and when I was visiting my daughter who was studying abroad, and they're just moving between countries in Europe and on public transit is just unbelievably easy and comfortable and very nice, by the way. And my view of it is I don't understand how we, as an American society, who claim to be so innovative and so conscious about sustainability, or claiming to be wanting to be a leader in sustainability, we're still investing in these high carbon footprint strategies. So I think we need to do better. I think we need to begin to examine our history. And that's one of the things we don't do in our public policy making. We fail to examine our history. If anybody looks at the history of highways and development, and by the way, the other problem is that economic development that is supported by highway development simply itself also fuels inequalities, because it continues to allow the outmigration of resources to the suburban region with no regard for ensuring that those opportunities are evenly distributed throughout the region. And so again, we have to be really mindful, and we as planners, as a planner, I'm always conscious about what every decision that is made from an economic development vantage point, how that is going to manifest itself in either exacerbating or addressing or redressing these issues of inequality. And so unless we're really deliberate and actually action oriented and doing that, we're going to be complicit in continuing to replicate the problem. Well, we all have to play a part. Groups like yourself have to organize and to call the question when you're seeing, as you are, when you're seeing these inequities and these policies that make no sense and that continue to foster both the sustainability problem and the equity problem, calling them into question, calling them to the mat. And asking, why are we doing this? And by the way, those public dollars that are being dispersed for highway construction are our dollars. And those dollars, when deployed, should be creating better, more equitable outcomes, not exacerbating the existing inequalities. And so this is not just a question of, we want to do the right thing, a nice thing, but everybody's contributing those public dollars. So those public dollars shouldn't be skewed in ways that benefit the privileged or those who are in a better position to navigate the region because they have cars, or because they happen to be located in a suburban region, or because they've now been released from having to live in the city. Because the state policy has kind of further drained the city of its resources by allowing such a policy to exist. So I think we have to begin to think strategically about what are the causes of all these inequalities and be committed to changing them. I think looking very closely at our economic development policy practices is one important step. There's a group called GAR, Governmental Alliance for Racial Equity, that has produced lots of discussion amongst governmental entities about equitable decision-making and using frameworks for deploying equitable decision-making across any number of things, whether it's transportation, housing, whether it's the development of parks, it doesn't matter. But that we have to use a lens, an equity lens in assessing all decisions that we make, because if we're not deliberate and purposeful, the undergirding system that we're all operating on is going to naturally produce the inequality, because that's the way it's been set up. And unless we deliberately challenge it at every moment, at every day, we're going to get the same outcomes that we've been seeing. So, so the remedy is us, and the remedy is demanding of our government a set of a revised and a renewed commitment to racial and economic equity. And look, government created this problem. I mean, it was governmental policy, deliberate de jure governmental policy. Our court systems reinforced that policy. So at every level, government created this problem. It still does today. Our large lot zoning is, the fact that communities don't want to have low-income housing located where they, in their communities. All of these things contribute to this ongoing disparity. And they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I suggest that we maybe get out of that insane cycle and begin to closely examine our policies using that equity lens. And maybe when you guys are talking to your kids about these issues, something would have changed. So I think that's all I have to say on that. I don't know if there's one thing. You asked me one thing to take away. I don't think, the reason I say one thing is because you have to understand that we're operating in a larger system. And so at every turn of their system, there's something that's creating the inequality, whether it's from the choices that we make in economic development, whether it's the policies that we develop in allowing certain resources to escape the city, whether it's policies that we don't hold people accountable who are benefiting from the city to support the city in terms of its tax base. I mean, there's so many places in which this problem resides. There can't be one solution. There has to be a multifaceted approach. So if there's one thing that I would say is that, one, it has to be comprehensive. Two, that we as a society, as individuals concerned, have to every day work on this problem, because it won't work on itself. Three, that we have to hold government fundamentally accountable. This phone every once in a while rings. So what I would say is that, we really do have to hold government accountable. We have to remind ourselves that at every turn, there's issues that we have to deal with in terms of policy, and then we have to tie it to these larger concerns of sustainability of our society. Because when we invest in public transportation sources, when we invest in other means by which people can navigate the region, we're improving the ability of people to make choices and lessening the burdens on some that many experience, and heightening the opportunities for those communities to prosper. Pleasure to be of help, and I like the fact that your group is really pushing these issues. So, and I really do hope you continue to organize and connect these, and connect. And and one of the things that I liked is the fact that on at least one of the campaigns that it appeared that you really are trying to connect this issue of transportation to economic development, because those are things that are really linked, and appreciating how they are linked and how they kind of reinforce the challenges that we experience in terms of fairly distributing opportunity and resources throughout the region is key. So I appreciate you guys thinking really holistically, that it's not just about mobility, it's also about resource distribution.